Off we go. Welcome and thank you all for joining us on this kind of dreary London evening. I have a sense that my colleagues in South Africa are having probably better weather than we are. But thank you for joining us. So this is the, I would say, inaugural session of the Art Club Digital. So my colleague Anne-Marie and I are co-hosting this evening, and we have created something called Art Club Africa in London. The idea being that London, as many of you will know, has many art clubs, but not many art clubs focusing on art from Africa and its diasporas. My name is Kate Fellens. I am head of international development for Strauss and Company, which is an auction house, a fantastic auction house, headquartered in South Africa. And we host events between London, Cape Town, Joburg, private sales auctions, etc. But one of our main focuses as a company is around education and promoting of the arts, appreciation for the arts, artists, and curatorial practice and studies. So Art Club is a product that really focuses on that side of the game. We had our first live art club in London in person at the Tate Modern. We were welcomed beautifully by the curatorial staff there and given a beautiful tour of the Moloi exhibition. This is our first digital Zoom, and the goal of this is to create a space where people can join no matter what location you are in the world, age, schedule, etc. So without further ado, I will introduce my colleague Anne-Marie Nkgopoleng, who is a communications specialist with a particular area of interest in sort of African art and its diasporas. So I'll let her host this evening, and then she will introduce you to our specialists and writers and curators in South Africa, who will give you a sort of sneak peek top look of what's coming up at 154. Thank you so much.
Hi, evening everyone. Thanks, Kate, for the introduction. So as Kate mentioned, my name is Anne-Marie and I'm a communications specialist. I work predominantly in and around London, but have had the privilege of working quite an international roster of projects. And so in conversations, Kate and I thought it would be an idea to kind of have a regional focus on the upcoming London contemporary art season. And so to do that, we've got, like she mentioned, two specialists here from Strauss based in South Africa who are joining us for this call. So we've got Dr. Alastair Meredith, and he heads up the fine art department at Strauss and is a senior specialist there. And also Nkgopoleng Moloi, who is a researcher, art curator, writer, all the amazing things, also based in South Africa, and they will be discussing a selection of artists that they've picked who will be presenting works or exhibiting works at 154, which is the leading international contemporary African art fair in the world. So they've got 3 editions annually, one in Marrakesh, one in New York, and then this flagship edition in London, which is coming up next week from the 10th to the 13th of October at Somerset House. So hopefully for those of you here who are London based, you'll be planning to go, or hopefully this will encourage you to go and you can kind of see some of the works in person that will be discussed here. But for those of us who can't make it, then hopefully this will give some insight into what will be going on over there. So I'm also very excited to sit back and listen and watch and see the presentation, but I will be fielding the chat for questions. So if there are any questions that come up during the presentation, please pop them in there and we'll try and circle back at the end. But I will hand over to you both. And yeah, I'll be here if there are any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you, Kate. And yes, welcome. It's amazing to be doing a talk like this, reaching out around the world. I'm just going to share my screen if you give me a second. Okay, I just want to check, Kate, if you can give me a thumbs up. Is that showing the right slide? Perfect, thank you so much. Yes, so Nkgopoleng and I are going to talk about 10 artists showing in the upcoming 154 Contemporary Art Fair in London. As Anne-Marie was saying, just perhaps to whet your appetite a little bit. I'm in Johannesburg at the moment, but I will be in London next week, so I'm really looking forward to this amazing fair. Anne-Marie sort of gave you a little bit of an overview of 154. I expect everybody knows about it, but for those of you that don't, it's the leading art fair focusing on contemporary art from Africa and the diaspora. It was started by Toria Al-Galawi, this woman on the screen, started in 2013. Toria is the daughter of Hassan Al-Galawi, very important Moroccan painter, incidentally. But the fair takes place across the world, flagship setting, as Anne-Marie mentioned, being Somerset House in London. Also in New York, a bit of a roving venue. The fair has taken place in Brooklyn, in Harlem. This year, a couple of weeks ago, it was right in the heart of the art world in Manhattan, in Chelsea. And then it takes place at La Mamounia in Marrakesh, in Morocco. Those are the 3 iterations of 154. I expect you all know where the name comes from. One continent of Africa with 54 countries. And it's been an enormous success, certainly from our side as an auction house on the continent. It's something we've always been so excited about and very desperate to support in any way we can. 154 in London, which starts next week, includes, I think, over 60 exhibitors from around the world, over 160 artists being shown. It comes with an amazing program of talks and special projects. And it just seems to get better and better and become more and more weighty, show better and better artists, which is, as I say, very exciting. So Nkgopoleng and I have kind of selected 5 artists each to talk about. I'm going to go through 2 first, and then Nkgopoleng will go through 5, and then I will end with 3 towards the end of the presentation. I have to admit that I'm not on familiar ground myself. I wish I knew more about the pure contemporary African art scene as I do. My background is more in sort of early 20th century Southern African painting and sort of interwar painting. But the more I look at these artists showing at 154 in particular, the more excited I become. There really is some fabulous work being produced by the likes of this man here. This is Arthur Timothy, one of the artists I'm going to be talking about. The other, Thuli Makonjo, Romeo Mivakinin. And then I suppose I've paired these 2 artists, Omar Khan, Derek Ofoso Boateng, one a Senegalese photographer, the other Ghanaian. But you'll see maybe towards the end of the show how different they are. And it's so exciting that artists from different generations from the continent can be shown in one place. Anyway, I'm going to start with Arthur Timothy. Rather conveniently for my memory, he's represented by Gallery 1957, conveniently because that is the year that Arthur Timothy was born, and also because it is such an important year in the colonial history of Africa. 1957 was the year that Ghana gained independence. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to do so. And the leader of the liberation movement, Kwame Nkrumah, you're seeing him here on the left giving his inaugural address, I think on the 6th of March, 1957, is who led the country into a new era. That's also important specifically for Arthur Timothy because his father, Bankole Timothy, was a journalist in Accra where where Arthur Timothy was born. Bankole Timothy wrote a biography on the liberation leader Kwame Nkrumah. I'm showing you an image in the center there, From Cradle to Grave. Something must have been said between the 2 at some point, and I can't quite work out what it was, but it forced Bankole Timothy and his young family to flee, Accra, and they end up in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And ultimately, a young Arthur Timothy spends his first childhood years in Freetown. This image, of course, shows you Bobby Moore lifting the old World Cup trophy in 1966, which is not an outrageously irrelevant image, as you might expect. I'm showing it to you because it's the exact context that the Timothy family moves to England. In 1966, Bankole, his wife Adeline, and his sons move from the west coast of Africa permanently to England. And that is, I think, vitally important in terms of his artistic context. He attends school at the Queen's School in Taunton in Somerset. I imagine a very far cry from his childhood in Freetown. He ends up going to Sheffield University, where he qualifies as an architect, and he builds an incredibly successful architectural career through the 70s and 80s, working at major architectural firms in London, and then eventually starting his own firm in 1986. And as I say, built a very impressive architectural career. This is one of the homes he designed in Freetown. It's called the Timothy House in Freetown, so a family home, presumably. I'm showing it to you not only because it is proof of his architectural background, but also just to make a point about the sort of tree accessories, these sort of ghostly trees that he adds to these architectural representations. I think you'll see them in some of his paintings. Anyway, his art career really starts as late as 2018. Christmas 2018, his son Duval gave him a blank canvas, a large blank canvas. Presumably, he was trying to encourage his father to paint more. Being an architect with a legitimate training in draftsmanship, he was clearly a very good draftsman, technically correct draftsman, and had been painting as a hobby for many, many years. But his son gives him this blank canvas, and he spends a lot of time working out what on earth he's going to paint. But he ends up painting this work here, which is called Party Frocks, which is, I think, not bad for your first ever serious painting, large in scale. It shows his mother, Adeline, on the right. And as I say, it's his first painting. His second major painting is this one on the right. It shows his parents, Bankole and Adeline. And I think when you look at them, you'll get a sense of them mimicking family photographs, just simple event snapshots. And that's because it's exactly where these paintings came from. At some point, Arthur Timothy found a cache of old family photographs, black and white photographs of his family, particularly their lives in Accra and Ghana, and also in Freetown. And he uses these black and white photographs, like the one I'm showing you on the left, as inspiration for his paintings. This is a photograph from the mid-1960s from a passenger liner, the MV Oriole. It's I suppose, a scene of people having fun on a sort of slippery pole, sort of on the deck, on the swimming pool. And he would have used a similar photograph to this to paint a painting that I'm showing you here. This is from, I think, 2021. It's a work called Brothers 3. It's literally using photographs from the family's voyages on the MV Oriole from the west coast of Africa to Britain and back. They obviously made this trip many times over the decades. This is a painting of Arthur and his brother Desmond. Arthur is the younger and smaller of the two in the center of the composition, and his older brother Desmond, you'll see again in a moment. These are the paintings from a similar time, 2021. The painting on the left called Big Man. This is Arthur Timothy's father, Bankole, on one of the crossings, and one of his father's friends on the right. These are fabulous paintings. I love the idea of them being completely transformed into sort of wild technicolor from these very, very small family photographs in black and white. I love that kind of transformation. This is an installation shot from a solo show in London at Gallery 1957, a show called Postcards from the Promised Land. And I'm showing you these works to, I suppose, give you a sense of the different styles that Arthur Timothy uses in his paintings. These are two works from that show, the work on the left called Lacquer, and the work on the right called, I think it's called Adeline's Fig. But these are so completely different in style. And in an interview, Arthur, in fact, says that he's not interested in style as it can be limiting. I think the object in painting pictures is to try to move the senses by intensifying reality. I think that's quite an important point, because looking at these two paintings side by side, you would, you wouldn't necessarily be far wrong if you were to argue that these were by different painters entirely. This work on the right is very expressionist in the way it's produced. These fabulous colors, very, very evocative. You get the sense of this amazing fig tree in silhouette with this light sort of poking through the holes in the leaves. It has a wonderful sort of Art Nouveau line, whereas this painting on the left is much more linear, much more clinical, I think, in the way it's painted, and far more obviously linked to his architectural background. In terms of the artist trying to move the senses by intensifying reality, he also goes on to say that this can be achieved. How it can be achieved depends on how intensely one understands and feels for the person or object of one's choice. And this is a landscape, an architectural landscape from Freetown. And I have to say, it's the most fabulous conflation of an encroaching landscape with these fabulous banana leaves and palm fronds, and this spotless clinical architectural ruin. I really think it's a wonderful painting. I love how those shallow arches in the center of the composition are painted quite abstractly in that gentle sort of mauve and lilac, and on the bottom of the canvas you get a wonderful sense of perspective coming from his architectural training, and a real sense of a courtyard opening in the distance with that wonderful yellow light and those dark arches. Yeah, wow, amazing painting. This is an installation view from the Armory show in New York last year. So having made his first paintings early in 2019, sort of serious paintings in 2019, both of which were accepted for the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy, incidentally, that year. He goes on to have a solo booth at the Armory show in 2023, which is quite amazing. This show is called Desmond, and it focuses entirely on his older brother Desmond, who passed away at some point, and I actually don't quite know when, but he passed away young, I understand. And this is Arthur Timothy essentially painting memories of his brother using these old black and white photographs. This is a work on the left. It's called New Borders, and it shows presumably the two brothers arriving at Queen's School in Taunton. And he describes this series of painting as allowing him to come to terms with his loss, that vivid memories come to life during the process of painting. There were moments of joy, humor, relief, and even transfiguration while creating these paintings, and this was the catharsis that he experienced. Yeah, amazing body of work. There's a work called The Zoo with the two brothers. Halcyon Days on the left, of the two brothers sort of eating ice cream, and a more formal portrait called Bayswater on the right with their mother Adeline. Yeah, so an incredible, very personal way of working through that kind of trauma, and again this amazing sense of transforming these little black and white physical archival records into these amazing Technicolor memories on a large scale. This work is also called Desmond. It wasn't on the show in 2023 at the Armory because it was painted more recently. It was painted in 2024. But wow, I think this is a knockout painting. It shows his deceased brother in his sort of colors blazer from Queen's School with the crest in the center. He's obviously an incredibly good-looking, muscular young man. But to me, particularly if you look at the shoes, they seem brand new. They look like they were laced up yesterday. And there's a real sense of this work being produced very, very recently, and therefore the sitter being present so recently. And of course, once you know that's not the case, it has an incredible sort of emotive charge, I would argue. Anyway, Arthur Timothy's work, I think, falls under the broad banner of Black figuration. It's a term that maybe is losing its potency, but a term that has been used readily over the last decade, describing the enormous interest in Black figuration, whether they're Black bodies or paintings by Black artists from Africa and the diaspora. So artists, of course, like Lynette Yaden-Bokye. This is her work, A Black Allegiance to the Cunning, that sold at Christie's in New York, I think in May, for about $3 million US, so very much in demand. Kerry James Marshall, this is the work of Beryl Wright, a very important African-American art history or art historian and curator who died very sadly. This is Kerry James Marshall's sort of homage to this important art historian. Mwaka Bwafo, of course, hugely in demand. The work on the left, called Gold Daytona, available through Gagosian, I think, at the moment. An artist who paints often with his fingers, but an artist again achieving remarkable prices on the secondary market. Kahinda Wiley needs no introduction, famously painting the portrait of Barack Obama. His monumental works in this crazy sort of stained glass effect are well known, being shown all around the world, often showing these figures in their flashy designer brands, their Louis Vuitton and skinny jeans and Nike trainers, but work on a monumental scale. Just get a sense of how large these works are. Moving closer to home, and I'm saying closer to home in terms of Southern Africa, artists working sort of under this Black figuration banner would include Kudzanai Violet Kwame from Zimbabwe. This is some amazing painting. I love the background. Look at that background with those electric pinks, and look at the symmetry. It's a sense of a sort of a butterfly painting, a squidge painting that's been unfolded, showing this crowd of pink figures laughing with this amazing semi-nude lying on rumpled sheets. Amazing painting. Zanele Mohole, of course. Portia Zvavahira, using this amazing sort of simple block printing element in the decorative surface of her works. Billy Zangewa, this a silk embroidered work called Afternoon Delight #1. Mary Sibande, using her alter ego Sophie as this Black figure of power and authority. Michael Armitage, very well-known work called My Dress, My Choice, from that very disturbing moment in the social history of Nairobi, 2014, when a woman is ripped, or her clothes are sort of ripped off her body because this male crowd felt that they were too revealing, and this riffing off that historical moment with this crowd of men, this intimidating crowd of men in the top register, and you can just see their shoes and trousers sort of ogling this Black naked body, sort of very much in the mode of Titian's Rokeby Venus. And in the bottom register, these 4 big round eyes of these bush babies, Nkgapis as they're called locally, making it very clear that the viewer has been picked too, and that the viewer becomes part of this sort of strange voyeuristic moment. Wow, amazing painting. Also, Xinga Samson, whose work was recently on show at the Norval Foundation, a very early career retrospective, but his figures very haunting, with this sort of grey gossamer element over the surface of the canvas, the figures with their almost zombie-like vacant Modigliani eyes. Anyway, I would argue that an artist like Arthur Timothy very much falls into this recent tradition of black figuration. The next artist I'm going to show, I promise you I'm not going to talk as long about all the others, is Thuli Mokonjo. She was, I think, 8 years old when a photograph like this was taken. This is when Namibia gained its independence in 1990. Thuli was born in southern Angola to Namibian parents, essentially, who had crossed the border to join the liberation fight, essentially, of SWAPO. Her young life was spent in refugee camps. It was an itinerant life. And I suppose because of that, her art making, her works are dealing with issues of displacement, but also focusing very heavily on her specific Namibian heritage, the ideas of lineage and ancestry and tradition are the major sort of pillars of her work. And I don't think you would imagine those very weighty issues when you see works like this at a distance hanging in a gallery space. They are immediately quite light-hearted when you look at them, with these, lovely, gentle pastel colors, these block patterned elements. But of course, on closer inspection, they are far more weighty indeed. She uses a lot of old photographs again. And I think you'll see that as a major theme running through many of these artists showing at 154 in London. These historical photographs that she transfers onto canvas, onto sheets, many of which have been buried in the land, buried underground, before they are used and worked into. She has a number of unusual techniques, like the one I've just explained, the idea of her works being part of the land, part of the earth, being buried underground. She also uses, I think it's called mohanga grain, which is like a millet, which is a staple food in northern Namibia specifically, and she uses that mixed with resin into canvases and sheets as part of her art making process, which allows her to create remarkable works like this. I mean, I think this is a spectacular work. It's called Let the Grains Be Pounded, which is also such a fabulous title. And it uses a historical photograph, a group of figures in front of their thatched hut, essentially pounding grain, this very everyday moment in these people's lives. Of course, she's changed the lens entirely. There's this fabulous gold film over that historical document that she's worked paint into these sort of globules, raindrops in blue and gold and yellow, sort of falling down over the figures. And you'll see at the bottom, I suppose very much in my mind, in the mode of Frida Kahlo, using the motif of arteries and veins to talk about tradition and lineage. And you see these sort of shrieking yellow elements moving up through the composition, linking things all the time. That is not paint, that is yellow thread woven into these canvases. This is a detail of the work, which, to go off on a little bit of a tangent, made me think of the obvious lyrical and spiritual element in the surface of a work like this, which happened to remind me very strongly of one of my favorite sort of traditional Namibian painters, and that is Adolf Jensch. Look at the stitched elements here around the figures' heads, like these halo elements. Get a sense of this sort of general spiritual tone when you look at a detail by Adolf Jensch. You know, this is Adolf Jensch painting in the Namibian landscape, having just arrived from Dresden in 1938. You know, Dresden being this industrial heartland just before the Second World War. And Jensch comes to Namibia, Southwest Africa, as it was then, and he paints with this fabulous calligraphic, almost Eastern spiritual way. And to me, there's a very close similarity in that element between Thuli's work and one of the great early 20th century painters from Namibia, that being Adolf Jensch. Staying on that tangent, it did make me think of how few painters we know about from Namibia over the last 100 years. And please don't bite my head off. Of course, there are many, many artists having worked in Namibia for hundreds of years. But I suppose I'm meaning in the more commercial sense. Whenever we are doing shows here in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, where we're trying to incorporate artworks from our neighboring countries, you know, Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, we often struggle to find works from Namibia. And the known tradition, the well-known tradition of art making in Namibia is sadly quite scant. If you talk about Namibian artists, you might think of artists like Axel Ericsson, who was born there in 1878, trained in Germany the early years of the 20th century, but painted traditional post-impressionist pictures like this. Fabulous, amazing paintings like this one here of the Spitzkoppe in 1921. You might think of Fritz Kramper, who wasn't born in Namibia, but spent a lot of time there, painting in the 50s and 60s before he was killed by an elephant in 1966. You might think of Nico Ruiz, who also wasn't born there, but spent a lot of time there. And I would also argue has a lyrical, spiritual element to the way he paints. But most people, when they think about a major artist from Namibia, would probably think of John Mafangeo, who was a master printmaker and an incredible artist. I'm showing you a detail here of one of his liner cuts from about 1976. It's a work called Mafangeo's Kraal. And I suppose I'm showing it to you because I love the comparison between John Mafangeo and Thuli's work, especially when you think about all these little vignettes that both artists focused on, all these linking elements, whether it's barriers in the linoleum block or these sort of stringed embroidered elements sort of moving through Thuli's canvases. I'm going to stop there, and then Nkgopoleng is going to talk about another few artists, then I'll end off at the end, depending on how much time we have left. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Nkgopoleng can take over for a bit.
Perfect. Let me first share my screen, and then I'll get into it. Is that okay? Can you give me a thumbs up, Kate?
Yeah, perfect. I can see the presentation.
Let me just try and make it full screen. Is that all right?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Firstly, thank you so much, Al, for that beautiful foundation that you have set for us tonight. Of course, the assignment is to think about top 10 artists to look out for at 154 Art Fair, which is the Contemporary Art Fair. But as you were talking and kind of drawing these connections for us, I was reflecting on how wobbly and how unreliable these terms are. You know, the fact that what we consider to be contemporary today is in fact very much influenced and founded on all the work that the great modernists that you have kind of touched on have presented. And so this lineage just kind of continues on and on and on. And so these notions of what is contemporary, what is modern, can sometimes be quite flimsy. That being said, I want to start with a great modernist, Mohamed Melehi from Morocco, who tells us that when we think about art history and reading art, we shouldn't only think about a series of dates, theories, and aesthetic formulas, that we should also consider the profound reasons and the consequences for artistic creation. He urges us that the very concept of what we think of as beautiful changes when we understand the reasons why artists make what they make. And for me, that's kind of what I was thinking about and contemplating on as I was thinking through this very difficult assignment of kind of picking out 10 artists from an incredible suite of artists who are showing at 154. And of course, the other question to consider is the fact that typically art fairs are spaces of trade. It's very difficult to think of them as spaces of possibility and spaces of experimentation. But as you have shown us, Elle, if you start to kind of dig deeper and draw these connections, it becomes possible to kind of see otherwise than just kind of thinking about the market. And so for me, when I was thinking through my list of artists, I wanted to reflect on works that transcend the boundaries of traditional aesthetics, works that have deep focus on concept, but also on the art object itself, that artists are really thinking critically about the object that they're making, and they're putting a lot of time and effort into making the object to become something that we can call beautiful, however you define that. And so at this moment, we're obviously at a very tumultuous time, politically, economically, socio-politically, which means that a lot of artists are being drawn to challenging conventions and challenging the way things are, challenging tradition. But at the same time, we are also at a crossroads because this rhetoric of other worlds and other ways and other imaginaries is also being contested. And so this is just to kind of lay the ground of the theory or the theoretical questions that were going through my mind as I was thinking through my top 5 to present to you. I am going to talk about the work of Seni Awa Kamara, who comes from Senegal, the work of Renata Sadimba, who comes from Mozambique, the work of Safa Eras, who comes from Morocco, Tebo Petojo, who comes from Botswana and South Africa, as well as Damilola Onosowobo, who comes from Nigeria. And so I'm very lucky that through this selection, I'm able to cross through different geographies in Africa, but also different mediums, different times of making, as well as different conceptual frameworks. So let's start with Seni Awa Kamara. I first came across Seni's work through a video that was made to accompany the work of the British artist Richard Long, who is well known for his endeavors kind of flaneuring around the earth and making sculptures from the land. One filmmaker who was following Richard came across the work of Seni Awa Kamara in the very, very early days and started to kind of capture the ways in which Kamara was making her sculptures. A lot of the work is kind of known for what they call Seni's children, these kind of figures that she makes that resemble not only children that are alive and are around her and are living within her life, but also children that perhaps she is imagining that never came to be, and those that have passed on as well. And so from this body of work, we have a very rich tradition that tells not only of kind of the importance of her craft within her family and her lineage, but also kind of totemic works that evoke bestial as well as maternity scenes. And so you've got this conflation between the real, but also fantasies, as well as kind of that other realm of the spiritual and the haunted and the haunting as well. For me, Kamara remains a really important artist, it's quite interesting because sometimes an artist can remain unknown for a very long time, and then something critical happens, and all of a sudden they are part of the zeitgeist. And something similar happened for Kamara. In 1989, there was a very contested exhibition that was put together called Musicians de la Terre, where a lot of African artists who were working within the tradition of modernism were kind of taken from different parts of Africa and showcased around the world through this exhibition called Musicians de la Terre. The exhibition received a lot of criticism because instead of kind of capturing the differences and the importance of African modernity, it created some really, I guess weird is the word, weird comparisons between African artists who were making at the same time as European and Western artists who were making within the modernist tradition. And so Rashid Aaron wrote a really beautiful criticism of the exhibition, talking about the fact that European artists considered what they did to be in the tradition of Bauhaus, whereas they considered what African artists did to be in the tradition of mud houses. And so this just kind of shows you the contrast of primitivizing artists who came from Africa, despite the fact that they were quite innovative and quite, at the forefront of the techniques, at the forefront of materiality, as well as at the forefront of rigorous conceptual inquiry within their works. And so in 2022, Michael Armitage, who Alastair spoke about briefly, did something really wonderful. Michael Armitage is an artist who hails from the East, from Kenya. That's kind of where his roots are, even though he is educated and lives and works in the West. And so he put together a beautiful exhibition called Among the Living, which was staged at White Cube Gallery in London. And as part of that, he wanted to be in conversation with Seni Awa Kamara's work, who he has looked up on for a very long time. And for me, this became a really important moment because not only are you talking about a conversation between geographies, kind of the West talking to the East in terms of West Africa, where Kamara comes from, and Kenya, where Michael comes from, but you're also talking across mediums, that Michael is someone who works within a very rigorous painting tradition, and how that can be in conversation with the kind of medium of sculpture. So I'll just tell you a little bit about how Michael Armitage works within his practice. Oftentimes he paints with oil on something called lubugo, which is a cloth that is made from fig tree bark. And often this cloth is sourced from Uganda, and it's traditionally used in ceremonial burial rites and rituals. And so he uses this as a material that is quite resonant, as a way to think about the ground, as a way to think about the land, but also as a way to attempt to attach himself to kind of the land of where he comes from. And so already you can see these similarities and these conversations between notions of the dead, the living, within both works in this exhibition. And so it's quite exciting that Kamara's work will be at the fair this year. These are just some images that I wanted to show you to kind of situate you through what that exhibition looked like. Another thing about Kamara's work that I wanted to point to is also the fact that they tend to be very horizontal and kind of very proud of themselves in terms of how they stand, which is something that might sound obvious to point out. But of course, within the tradition of minimalism in particular, there is a question around how artworks are figured, whether they become these phallic, monumental, overbearing, overpowering structures, or whether they tend to be closer to the floor and closer to the ground, kind of requesting or calling upon the audience or the viewer to lean into them. And so as a woman who's creating very early on in Africa, in West Africa, I find this to be a very powerful gesture that she's working within, this tradition of kind of horizontality. Actually, sorry about that. I think I'm a little bit, what is the word? Feeling a little bit uncomfortable. So I'm actually mixing my horizontal and vertical. What I meant is the work is vertical as opposed to horizontal, but I'm sure you got that. So thinking about horizontality as flatness and thinking of verticality as monumental and kind of overbearing and overpowering. And so we see this in Kamara's work as perhaps a way to kind of claim space and a way to kind of claim what it is that she's doing in her practice. Okay, I wanted to point to the fact that Kamara uses clay within her practice. That is kind of a key material that kind of makes up the work that we see. And of course, there's many different stories and kind of narratives that we can draw around the material of clay. But for me, one person who I think about consistently, who works within this material among many others, is of course the great Theaster Gates. He speaks of the humility and intelligence that is inherent in the material of clay, that within the material of clay, there is built into it an intelligence that has been a way in which civilizations for a very long time have kind of used the material to tell stories of their people, not only of the living, but also of those into the eternal realm as well. And so when I saw this quote, immediately my mind went to this incredible work that kind of gestures in very different ways to the living and the dead and so on. These are some additional works by Kamara that were made recently. This in the middle is the famous Kamara children, Seni's children. That's usually how they're called, where she kind of makes all of these strange looking, absurdist figures that are attached to each other and kind of share space in a very kind of concrete, and very embodied way. And of course, the question of the maternal, the question of the mother comes across as well. And we see that in this image on the left. And then finally, we have the snake man that she made in 2021. And all of these are fired clay. The work of Seni Kamara leads us directly into another incredible artist who I absolutely adore. And for me, I wanted to think about Renata Sedimba's work in relation to the rupture that we usually find within African art making or discourses around African art making. We often kind of try to delineate between Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and Lusophone Africa. And oftentimes it's difficult to find convergences between all of those three spheres. And people like Renata Sedimba have allowed us the opportunity to be able to theorize on women's work, or typically what would be called women's work, which is something I'll come back to a little bit later, but also thinking through how we think about all of these traditions across Anglo, Franco, and Lusophone Africa. I will show some examples of different sculptural traditions that Renata kind of works within that are similar to those that we have in South Africa in particular. But I was quite drawn to the fact that one of the stories that we're often told about Renata is her insistence on the importance of language. She was obviously born in Mozambique, as I said, and so she comes from a tribe called Makonde, which is a Bantu ethnic group that is spread across northern Mozambique, Kenya, and southern Tanzania. And of course, you'll forgive me for using the word tribe. I'm using it with quotation marks with all of its contestations that kind of come with that. But one of the things that Renata was quite insistent on for a very long time was that she refused to engage with the art world outside of her own language. And so she would have studio visits with people, curators, other artists, writers. And as she's having all of these studio visits, she would insist on speaking the language of her homeland. And for her, it was important that it was much more important to kind of retain her identity and to insist on the importance of identity over and above kind of the idea of trying to communicate something through her artworks. And so her artworks were necessarily a way to communicate stories that needed to be understood, that needed to be linear, but rather that they needed to be felt. And if someone had access to them through the local language that the Makonde people speak, then that would kind of be an additional thing that they would be able to glean from that. Renata's work makes me think of whether it's important or not to bridge thought and form, whether it is possible to look at an artwork and to experience it purely from its kind of formal elements without necessarily understanding or knowing the conceptual frameworks that led to that making. And this is something that I kind of go back and forth on in terms of my own kind of enjoyment and thinking through different artworks. At certain times, I see the value and the importance of kind of, painstakingly trying to understand what it is that artists are saying. But also I see the value in just kind of letting the work wash over you and having that sensual response towards what it is that we're seeing. Renata, as well as Seni, our Kamara, for me, bring out three key important kind of questions that are very relevant within the realm of art making at the moment. The first one is debunking the notion of sculpture as an art form with no woman. And so earlier on, when I was talking about kind of verticality and horizontality, there is also this kind of long tradition of how art history is written, that when we think about sculpture making, we think about hard materials that are imposing, that are difficult to handle. And often those are materials that are dealt with by men. And so if you think about a lot of sculptures that we have that have been theorized and that have been written about, a lot of them actually tend to be men. So those are people who are working in metal, those are people who are working in wood, and so on and so forth. And so seeing the works of people like Kamara and Renata remind us that sculpture is actually an art form that is filled with a lot of women who are doing really incredible work at different levels. And of course, it also conflates the notion of what we consider craft versus what we consider art. It's interesting that when Kamara started working, she learned the craft from her community. And at that time, clay making had a very important use within the community. So people would make objects, and those objects had a particular utilitarian value within society, either as totems that they would use to pray, or as mugs or cups and dishes that they would use in everyday life. And so what she started to do was to transcend this notion of making artworks using clay for utility, but rather for purely aesthetic value. And so kind of bridging that line between what we consider perhaps craft into what we might consider an artwork. And I know I'm giving a lot of disclaimers. It's also because it's quite difficult to not propose these sometimes very problematic terms without necessarily having the time to expand on them. But I just kind of want to point out that this is also another ongoing discussion to kind of say, how do we think about how we consider the different things that artists are making? How do we actually describe them? How do we write about them? And how do we theorize on them? And of course, the idea of women's work has over the years been totally debunked, in the sense that a lot of the times artists that we are seeing today that are employing clay, that are employing wood, come from all sorts of different walks of life. And an incredible kind of example to that is the artist Fiesta Gates, who I've already kind of spoken about, who works across both soft and hard materials, but also organic, inorganic, material, immaterial, ephemeral, as a way to conflate these very kind of structured ways in which we try to think about artwork sometimes. And I was a little bit indulgent here in the sense that this isn't really part of the question, but I thought to myself, it's impossible to think about Kamara and to think about Renata without thinking about all of the other women who were working at the same time in the 1960s in Africa. And of course, this is only a very small portion of a very large suite of women who are doing incredible work. But I wanted to point your attention to some of my favorites. So we've got Constance Ekong, we've got Rosemary Karuga, we've got Estelle Magnolo, we've got Olinika, and we've also got Grace Kwame, whose works I will show you in the next slide. Rosemary is interesting for many different reasons. One of them is that she is primarily a collagist, which obviously is a very difficult material. But personally, in kind of my own research and learning about kind of different traditions of art making within the continent, one of the mediums that has been neglected is in fact collage. That, like photography, it took a very long time for collage to be considered a true artistic medium. And so I find it interesting that as early as 1960, Rosemary was already making these really wonderful collages and actually seeing them as artworks as opposed to something else. And this is me being indulgent again as a little bit of a segue. So this is the work of Grace Kwame, which I just think is incredible. I love the little heads that she makes to kind of speak about different stories. I just want to read you a little bit about what she says about her work. Let me just find my notes. Her fascination with clay began at a very tender age. She began to model this medium before the age of 5. So really she was making seriously from the age of 5. She developed a keen interest in portraiture. That's why we're seeing a lot of these heads that she makes. And she applied this method throughout her career, not only within sculpture making, but also within painting. She has a very rich painting practice. And her approach can be said to be one of the greatest contributions to a Ghanaian version of African modernism, a truly kind of African way of thinking about modernity and modern ways of making. And to finish off this suit with our wonderful sculptures, one of my core favorites from South Africa is Nuria Mabasa, who had a wonderful exhibition at the Villa Lekhodi Center for Sculpture about 2 years ago. And the exhibition was called Shaping Dreams. And of course, Nuria works across different materials. She works across clay, but also wood carving as well as an important part of her making. She speaks about dreams as being central to her art making process. She says, I need a dream to tell me what to make. Unless it comes to me in a dream, nothing will happen. I can't work. If I dream about it and I don't do it, I get sick. And to me, it's such a wonderful kind of provocation, going back to where I started, this notion of really understanding what it is that drives artists to make the work that they do, and that being a way that helps us then understand the works that we see and understand how they define beauty and how we can also define beauty when we look at their works. Okay, so the next artist that I have on my list is Safa, who is a Moroccan artist. And in a sense, I guess it is fitting because I did start with Mohamed Melehi with that wonderful quote. Safa is interesting for many reasons. So the first one is to go back to what Alastair said in his presentation, this push and pull or struggle between abstraction and figuration is almost as old as time. Someone told me a very interesting anecdote that if you were to send an alien from space or from wherever, and they came to Earth and they looked at all the art that we have made, they would actually believe that art making progressed in reverse. If you think about the artworks that we see today that are very minimal, that are geometric, perhaps it's just a square on a plane of yellow, versus the very early artworks that we were making in the beginning of time that were much more textured, much more rich, much more layered. One would actually think that how we started making art was with the minimalism and kind of the geometric forms, and developed that in reverse. And so this question of abstraction, figuration, how artists layer concepts and how artists layer visual languages is something that is critical, but also interesting. And that brings us to Safa's work. For her, she speaks about the importance of using white in her artworks. And of course, many people don't consider white to be a true color. A lot of the times we can think of white as perhaps a color that we use to soften other colors, or a color that we use to be able to add texture to an existing color, to mix two colors to create a different color. But very rarely do we think of white in itself as a pigment. She talks about the absence of color as her way, her deliberate chosen way to draw attention to the works that she makes, but also as her way to kind of create a conceptual strategy that kind of links to very formal compositions that we see in the works. And so there are two layers that I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, it's this question of color, which I will go back to. And then secondly, it's the materials that she uses within her practice. So often the materials are outside of the realm of traditional materials. So they're not just necessarily oil and paint and clay. They're often everyday objects that include pins and needles and razor blades. But also the way in which she puts them together is that there's always some kind of conversation between fragility, uncertainty, and sometimes hope between the materials that she uses. And so if we look at this work that she made from 2022, Order, Disorder, and the detail here on the right, we can see that there is that conversation between the very subtle, the very muted, perhaps safe that we get from the whiteness of the work against the much more kind of harsh tonality and texture that we get from the materials that she chooses to use and she chooses to make this work with. And for me, when I look at Safa's work, I couldn't help but think of Nicholas Hlobo. On the one hand, because of the use of white, that white comes across a lot in Nicholas's work, even though that's changed. I think he started with the rubber works that he made that were much more dense, and those tended to be black and sometimes a deep red, but more and more they've kind of changed towards these lighter renderings of works that he makes. Of course, Hlobo is interesting also because of how he thinks about this notion of puncturing the surface that he's working on. He talks about how this form of stitching becomes a way to think about healing different wounds. Whether it is psychic wounds that one gets from kind of thinking about identities that are at times conflicting. And so if you know Hlobo's biography, you will know that he is a Xhosa man who also identifies as a queer man. And so already for a long time, that created a disjuncture in how he thought about his identity. And so this stitching that we see in his work that is very meticulous, that is very beautiful, that is very considered, becomes a way of kind of healing oneself. He equates it to the kind of work that a surgeon would do, for example, as they stitch through very difficult wounds to try to get us to a place of healing. And so I just thought that that was quite a nice conversation between the work that we see from Safa to the work that Hlobo is making today. Alastair spoke a little bit about Black figuration, which is also another point of contestation. So I came across a term, they call it zombie figuration, basically as a way to kind of describe the trend that we see happening within painting in particular. That you started off, like I said, with figuration being very primal in a lot of art making. So if we think about the works of people like Gerard Sekoto, if we think about John Konakafimol, if we think about Gladys Mgutlandlu, Alastair, Maggie Lofsha, all of those people at some point in their life considered the figure critically. And of course, you had the big moment of rupture when we had people like Kerry James Marshall, who started to depict the figure in very deliberate ways, particularly the Black figure, with exaggerated skin tones as a way to speak about Blackness and as a way to kind of claim and assert one's identity. And that then brought on a whole generation of new artists who then kind of bought into this way of making as a way to speak about identity and identity politics, so to say. But then something happened in that more and more artists started to feel less comfortable with this way of making, which became a really interesting moment because those artists who were still interested in figuration, it meant that they had to experiment with how they would actually show us the figures that they're interested in. And so Tebe is one of those people who still is within that tradition of thinking about the Black body, but kind of being devoid from rendering the Black body very close to how it would look realistically. So the figures are usually dysmorphic in some way. They're always against this backdrop of acid green as a sound stage that they live on. And often they are disembodied, they are fragmented, or we only see partial aspects of their bodies. And for him, this is a way to speak about not only the rich tradition of painting that he is interested in, but also to think about embodiment and concealment, and also disappearance of the body. And later on, I'll try and make a connection between all of the painters that we see within the selection. And I'll kind of point back to this work that you're seeing now. This is just some of those images that I spoke about, where we see fragments of the black body coming through. And often, once again, we don't even know whether this is in fact a black body. So he speaks about this notion of trying to resist the urge of blackface, for example, and thinking about that cross-cultural history of blackface, and really teasing at it to try and get to perhaps a much more interesting and perhaps a less violent way of figuring the body, even though the images that we see often do actually feel quite violent and quite provocative. And so people like Thebe help us to think about painting not only as a sensual endeavor, but as a theoretical and conceptual undertaking, that it's less about looking at the works and kind of liking them necessarily. One might even apply the term ugly or provocative to these works, but a huge component of it is that painting becomes a conceptual endeavor as opposed to a sensual endeavor. But also critically, what they're trying to do is to bridge the gap between the ideas and the theories to physical reality. And I guess what they're trying to do also is at times bridge the gap, but at times actually make that gap much larger as a way to allow different forms and different things to kind of spread out from that rupture or from that suture. The last artist I will speak about is Damilola Onosowobo, who comes from Nigeria. Damilola works from a tradition of, often it's kind of the image comes from a photograph. And if it doesn't come from a photograph, it comes from a specific memory. And so there is something about reaching into a personal archive, whether that is a tangible archive that we're seeing in front of us in terms of a photo, or a personal archive that comes through memory, and using those archives to portray lived experiences of the people that she's interested in. And often the brush strokes are hurried, they're shadowy, they appear worn and they appear fragile, they're never pristine, they are somehow rough, but even though they are textured, they also have a sense of porosity and invite indeterminacy, that you're not really quite sure whether you're in a dream state or whether you're somewhere else. I also realized that I have been talking for a very long time, so I think I will end up there with my 3 concluding thoughts to try and kind of wrap everything together. So in thinking about the work of Senia Awakamara, Renata Sadimba, Safa Eres, Thebe Petaho, and Damilola, these are the 3 things that kind of became obvious to me as threads between the different works. Firstly, that these are artists who are interested in a tableau of personal and collective memory, which is a theme that we're seeing a lot at the moment, and that they are using a series of material pairings and drawing from the archive, but also thinking critically about mark making as conceptual gestures beyond just kind of the actual art object that we see in front of us. And I think I will leave it there.
Oh, amazing. Thanks so much, Nkgopoleng. I'll just quickly share my screen again. Well, I'm just gonna whisk through to where we were. Yeah, I think Nkgopoleng and I are both sort of pretty enthusiastic about these artists. I think we could spend hours and hours talking about them, but I will just skim through a few more, and we'll end off in a few minutes. Romeo Mivakinin is another artist that caught my attention. His career really started after he visited this amazing show called The Black Nude from Géricault to Matisse, which was at the Musée d'Orsay in 2019. Some of you might have been lucky enough to have seen it. But it might have been one of the first times when this young artist comes face to face with major, mainly 19th century pictures, like the one I'm showing you here. So sort of canonical art historical works defining the 19th century, and so much sort of art historical thought. This is Manet's Olympia, of course, from 1863, with a sort of woman laying on these rumpled sheets being presented these flowers on the morning after by this sort of black attendant. Also, he would have seen a work like this. This is Cézanne Scipion. And also Marie Benoit's incredible work from 1800, a portrait of Madeleine. You know, he would have been seeing these black bodies in very important art historical pictures. And what he essentially did was reinterpret them entirely. This is his version of Benoit's painting of Madeleine. He has inserted his own face into this composition, and it's a very evocative inclusion. You know, similarly, he takes the Bashi Bazouk, which is Gérôme's famous painting on the left, and converts it into his very personal view on the right. Perhaps most famously in his short career, he does the same with the Raft of the Medusa, Géricault's amazing sort of early 20th century painting. You'll see how he includes his face on many of the figures in distress on the raft. Similarly, riffing off Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' painting of the odalisque and enslaved woman and black eunuch. And he inserts himself in as the enslaved woman. He removes the black eunuch entirely from the composition. It also works with Edward Muybridge's sort of milestone studies of movement in art, and this is his version, which is quite remarkable. It's a strange conflation of Muybridge and Goya. If you think of his nightmares, yeah, an amazing work. Again, using photographs. This is quite remarkable. This is King Behanzin, the man smoking the pipe under the brolly. And this is, in fact, Romeo's great-great-grandfather, who was the Dahomey king, sort of in present-day Benin, who fought the colonial intrusion of the French in the 1890s, but was driven into exile. This is the artist's great-great-grandfather. And essentially what he does is he inserts himself into this historical moment. In a work like this, you can see him sort of sitting on the steps. And of course, it's a way of him coming to terms or understanding his own history, I suppose, trying to understand his links and lineage. You also see a strange way or how the work is produced. He uses these sheets and canvases, which he then soaks in what he calls an elixir, these potions, medicinal potions that he finds or acquires in the market in Cotonou in present-day Benin. And again, just like Nkgopoleng had spoken earlier about the idea of healing. This for him is a medicinal healing element in the work, and looking back at these historical moments. King Behanzin, you know, might sort of jolt your memory a little bit. Very recently, some of the artifacts taken from the king in the 1890s were returned by the French government. These are some of them sort of being returned. I think it was about 2 years ago or so. Finally, these two very different photographers, Omar Kar on the left from Senegal, born in 1930, and Derek Boateng, probably born in the 1990s. Omar Kar died in 2020, so he was 90 years old when he died. Two completely different artists from West Africa, completely different photographers, but I think an amazing comparison, but also a point that artists like this, both modern and contemporary, being shown at 154 in London. Omar was an itinerant photographer. He was a professional photographer. That is to say, he traveled around the rural parts of Senegal, essentially being paid to photograph people. And some of his works are quite remarkable. He has this strange characteristic or trait where he sets up this background curtain, just like he would in a studio, but makes it entirely visible outdoors. So you get this really strange sense of a sitter, like this man here, who's a stonemason, standing in front of a curtain, imagining himself being photographed really from the chest upwards, but being photographed from a much wider perspective. So giving a greater sense of his immediate environment. Quite an amazing photographer. This is Omar Kar again. These works come really from the late 1950s, maybe through to the early 1970s. I think if you look at it now, you'd imagine it's a young man looking at his phone. It's of course nothing of the sort. This is a work from the 1960s called Man and Comb, but a very familiar kind of motif nowadays, which leads us to Derek Boateng, who describes himself as an iPhone artist. So couldn't be any more different to Omar Kar. Boateng, who looks very much like Basquiat, incidentally, produces these highly saturated, composed photographs of his hometown Accra in Ghana. They are joyful in many ways. They are highly posed, as I mentioned. But I think if you dig a little deeper, there's maybe a little bit more to them than what you immediately see. He talks about this idea of hueism, which kind of conflates traditional proverbs and poetry in some kind of bright imagery like the ones he produces. This work, incidentally, is called Music Makes the Pain Fade, from a local proverb. And I suppose it's spawned this book called Hueism. I think the jury is still out on whether or not this becomes a major ism in the future, but very interesting nonetheless. The comparison, I think, between him and Omar Kar is also amazing in terms of access. You know, Boateng has something like 75,000 followers or something, which means every time he produces an image and publishes it, it is being seen by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people within hours. And I think that's crazy to think about in comparison to Omar Kar's practice, where he is literally being paid to take a photograph for a particular person. It's being printed and distributed in a handful of items. And I suppose to finish off, I'd like to make the point that as much as things change, they tend to stay the same, you know, because a work like this by Derek Boateng is completely controlled and composed. It's essentially a still life that is executed very, very carefully, just like a painting like this would have been nearly 100 years earlier. This is Irma Stern painting a Cape Malay woman in the sort of Newland forests, probably in 1930. And just like Boateng is composing his figure, so was Irma Stern at the time. And just to finish off, I suppose using Stern as a bit of a segue, I'd just like to tell everybody that Strauss will be not at 154, but in London next week. We are bringing a small selling exhibition to London. We are bringing 22 artworks and staging a show called Looking Towards Freedom, women artists from Africa, showcasing women and non-binary artists, mainly from the southern part of the continent. We'll be bringing mega key museum grade works by Irma Stern specifically, like the one I'm showing you here, Pondo Smoker, Arab Man from 1939, Congolese Woman. This, in fact, is staying in South Africa. It's currently on show at the Odeliuskamer in Stellenbosch. But this girl, Indian Girl Zanzibar from 1949, will be on show in London next week, alongside other modern and contemporary artists from the area, including Mary Sibande, Ruth Everard Hayden, glorious landscape called Riverland Stoop, Esther Mahlangu, who will be, I think, on the tip of many tongues in London. She's been commissioned to do a major mural, I think through the Serpentine Gallery. Turia Mugadlela, working in pantyhose, will be on show in London, as will Frida Locke. This is a glorious jewel-like painting, probably from the early or late 1950s. It's a work that when it came in, the seller told us it was called Woman Sewing, and it was incredibly confusing for us because we couldn't really see a woman, or certainly one sewing, but it turns out it's a recto verso. And when we removed the brown sheet from the back and turned it around, we did see this sort of ghostly, amazing figure of a woman sewing in the late 1950s. We'll also be showing work by Helen Teed, who's on a Tracy Eamon fellowship, I think, at the moment in England, as well as Gladys Muglandlu. Nkgopoleng mentioned her a little bit earlier, a fabulous a black modernist painter working in the 1960s and 70s, whose star continues to rise, and I wish we had access to more of her incredible paintings. Maggie Lopsha, and of course Zanele Mohole, Kate Gotkins, and Georgina Gratrix will also be on show. It is an exhibition open to the public, and you can check our website for more details. It will be in a little gallery space, Maison Pan, just off Trafalgar Square. So we hope, if you are listening from London, or if you're going to be in London next week for 154 and Frieze Masters, that we really hope you can come and visit and see some of these amazing pictures. Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, Kate and Anne-Marie.
Thank you all.
Sorry, go for it, Kate.
No, I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you all for hanging in there. I'm impressed by your commitment and enthusiasm, and Nkgopoleng and Alastair. That was really fantastic. We appreciate it. I don't know if there were any questions. There was a few that came in on the chat, and I replied directly. I don't know if Anne-Marie wants to field any questions.
I haven't seen any new questions come in, but we can maybe hang on for a couple of minutes in case there were any.
I've responded to a few, so I think maybe what we can do is, unless anyone has a question, speak up now. Otherwise, we will follow up with our e-catalog that will be live soon, as well as we've published a fantastic guide to Frieze Week, which is sort of visiting Frieze Week through an African lens. So it shows a lot of the exhibitions at 154 at Frieze, the Strauss exhibition, and museums across the city. So that is available on our website, and I will send everybody a link to that in the coming days. I think, unless we get any more questions now, we can wrap it up and say thank you to all for attending. And I hope anyone who's in London will come and see us in the flesh, just at our exhibition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
Thank
one.
you. Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.